Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Anarita Bashaliva, along with co-hosts Dr. Victor Fett, Dr. Katerina Shrey, and our program producer, Professor Larry Sherray. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you're joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use the chat to post any questions for our guest. A quick greetings to our viewers in Ukraine from Dr. Katerina Shrey.
Вітаємо наших слухачів в Україні з глибоким поклоном. Ми далі свідки вашого страшного терпіння і також вашої великої сили. Дякую вам за вашу участь в нашій тижневій програмі.
Thank you, Katerina. Today's guest will be introduced by Dr. Victor Fett.
Thank you, Nara. It's my pleasure to welcome to our 203rd week of MUkraine discussion group Dr. Todd HELMUS from RAND Corporation with a talk about Ukrainian resistance to Russian disinformation. Dr. HELMUS has PhD in clinical psychology from Wayne State in Detroit, Michigan, and he serves as a senior behavioral scientist at RAND Corporation and also professor of policy analysis in the RAND School of Public Policy. He is a nationally recognized expert on irregular warfare, terrorism, and information operations. Please, Dr. HELMUS.
Victor, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Let me share my briefing. All right. So I'm really honored to be a part of this. And I think I heard you say, 250 or some different sessions you've had during the course of this war. That's a really unfortunate length of time to be doing this, but such as it is. I'm here so I'm a senior scientist at the RAND Corporation. I do research on a variety of different issues for information threats, terrorism, foreign propaganda, among other things. And what I'll talk to you about today is this research that we did. We published this, I think, in 2024. Based on field research that we did in 2023, and have had subsequent trips, a subsequent trip to Ukraine that I can sort of add additional insights on based on this. But this is a labor of love. Anything that we can do to support Ukraine, I think, and particularly for this research, we wanted to understand how Ukraine was managing its information operations space, and partly to gain lessons for the United States and other allied partners on what we could derive from that. But it was a real honor to be able to visit Kyiv and to be able to talk to so many Ukrainians about the work that they're doing. It was inspiring in a lot of different ways. Okay, so in war, the first casualty is truth. In war, truth is the first casualty, and we've seen that being the case in multiple operations, from ISIS, the attack of ISIS into Ukraine and Syria. Truth has been a very difficult commodity to come by in the Israeli war in Gaza. So it's not surprising that truth, and particularly how we operationalize this disinformation operations, but it doesn't have to be disinformation or untruths. That's just broad propaganda operations, is particularly a problem in Ukraine. Ukraine has been a central experimentation warehouse for Russian information operations for a number of different years now. I remember being told by government analysts in Estonia that they saw what Russia was doing in Ukraine as itself, at least the information operations in Russia, is itself a prelude to war. And those sentiments certainly turned out to be true. But yeah, so given the degree to which Russia is engaging in information operations in Ukraine, given the particular angle that disinformation has been a very big focus of that, and when I say disinformation, I mean I'm referring to intentionally false narratives designed to influence a target audience. We wanted to see how Ukraine was responding to this propaganda wave that was coming at them in the midst of a kinetic war that they were facing. So to understand that approach, and then we also, the reason we wanted to understand that approach is to identify lessons for some of our different sponsors here at the RAND Corporation, and particularly U.S. Department of Defense and the Department of State and others, as well as U.S. allies, to learn to be able to identify for them what the key lessons they should be taking away from this conflict. So I will talk in two phases for this brief. The first, I will talk through Ukrainian operations to countering Russian adversary information efforts. And so I'll be the first half, and I'll try and extend that a bit, given I think the interest and focus and audience for this group. But then I'll also walk through, distill what some of the lessons we think are for the U.S. and its allies. So to do the study, we visited Kyiv in October 2023. It seems like a long time ago. Conducted interviews with representatives of Ukraine's government, military, and civil society. And as I think I mentioned before, we did do a follow-on trip back in late 2024. So we have, some additional insights on how the situation there has changed. I think in short, it's changed quite dramatically from our perspective for a variety of different reasons. But we'll sort of continue on here. Okay, Ukrainian approach. So one thing to remember is sort of as a scene setter here is the depth and scope of Russian information operations. We see Russia as engaged in Ukraine's job is not just to respond to Russian information efforts targeting Ukraine, but they need to respond to a worldwide litany of threats that Russia is engaged in. We refer to this information campaign as the three theaters of information war. Within Russia, Russia has, blocked access to independent or social media. They've basically criminalized criticism against the government, and of course, they are pushing forward a slew of propaganda, calling Ukrainians Nazis, but just a number of different narratives that are designed to justify their incursion, and then B, to help the population manage and sustain and absorb really high levels of casualties in that country. Russia, of course, engaged in Ukraine, and a number of different levels. And I think you'd need to spend an entire talk here to highlight all the different ways that Russia is engaged in these operations. In Ukraine, it's targeting Zelensky, it's promoting disunity. So when we were there, we heard stories about how Russia would target audiences near the front and say, "Why don't you have electricity? Kyiv has electricity, but you don't. That must mean Kyiv doesn't really care for you, or they're undermining you." So the whole point was to disunify communities. They would also try and build wedges between Russian and Ukrainian speakers, and the list would go on and on. But the challenge here, you just can't focus on Ukraine. Of course, Russian operations are heavily engaged in Europe and the U.S. with the goal of limiting NATO and alliance support for Ukraine. Within Europe, the themes are Ukrainians are Nazis, of course, but then also undermining Ukrainian refugees, trying to create wedges between the refugees and the host populations to where they're living. The corruption of Zelensky is a common theme in these types of things. At this time, I think high energy prices were an issue, so they really wanted to hit home high energy prices. Then, of course, election interference is a common thing. And of course, same in the U.S., but it's not just there. Of course, it's also in Africa and other places. And I think part of a reason you see countries like Russia and China target Africa is because they're really interested in the UN voting blocks. And so they've undertaken a number of operations there. with the goal of getting these countries to support Russia or abstain from key votes that might impact Russia. So now what I want to talk about Ukrainian shaping operations. There are, before the first shots in the second invasion wave were fired, there were a number of things underfoot that we think were vitally important to helping Ukraine prepare for this war from an information perspective. One, I think, since the time of the Maidan Revolution and Russia's invasion into Crimea, we saw all sorts of indications that the Ukrainian information space was marshaling and trying to build up capacity. We talked to a number of different organizations there, such as Detector Media, Stop Fake, Ukraine Crisis Media Center, that can all pinpoint their start of their organization to the waves of protests that were engaged in the Maidan. And those organizations started then, continued to build capacity over several years, put them in a prime position once this war started to be engaged in the information war. And of course, it even goes before that. I mean, USAID had been involved in supporting Ukraine from at least the early 2000s. And so both USAID as well as a number of international aid organizations invested heavily in Ukraine's information space over the course of many years that put it to a point where it had the strength that it did during the second invasion. Banning of Russian social media, this is a controversial issue here in the US, of course, because typically not engaged in banning domestic media. But Ukraine, I think in 2017, blocked access to Yandex and Mail.ru. I think in 2021, they blocked access to VK, and as well as different TV satellite networks that were sending information into Ukraine. We see this as a vitally important step for Ukraine, or at least something that helped them once this war started, because obviously those channels have been key conduits of information operations, and we did field research a few years ago, I think back in 2016 in Estonia and Latvia, and one thing we heard there is that Russia was very heavily invested in using satellite television and pumping out RT and Sputnik and other forms of media communications to reach the Russian language speakers there. I think that those efforts in Ukraine were stymied in 2017 and 2021 bode well for Ukraine. And finally, the pre-bunking of the Russian false flag operation. U.S. intelligence got wind of a planned effort by the Ukrainians to fake a Ukrainian invasion into Russia, and then use that as a call for war and to invade Ukraine. The U.S. decided to release that intelligence early and publicize that, which essentially prevented Russia from using that false narrative as a reason for their conflict. And I think that played a big role in, probably most people would not have believed that operation if it had gone on. But, even if only a few people believed it, then that is certainly something that could undercut international support for Ukraine. But that operation was stopped. And I'll say writ large, the Western community, US, UK, and others did a lot to release intelligence showing Russian plans for invasions, showing Russian preparations for invasion, for the false flag operation that really played a big role, I think, in distilling international support for Ukraine. Okay, so now talking about the Russian information war, and I just want to see what the next slide is. Okay, hang on a second. So how did Ukraine prepare for their information operations, or how were they organized to do their information operation efforts? So within Ukraine proper, now we're talking about efforts within Ukraine to protect Ukrainians from Russian disinformation operations. You have multiple entities. So on the government side, you have three different sort of key organizations. One is the Center for Strategic Communications and Information Security. Second, you have the Center for Countering Disinformation, and then third, you have the U.S. military information operations efforts. The CSC, or the Center for Center for Strategic Communications, we found them to be a very interesting organization for a number of different levels. One, they lead international narrative development and disinformation defense and awareness campaigns. They play a key role in helping to organize and work with and coordinate with Ukrainian civil society, and I'll speak to that issue next. But Ukrainian civil society is quite active in this space, and here you have a government organization that's directly charged with coordinating and working with them. They also do work to build capacity of key elements within the Ukrainian government, and they particularly have been focused on supporting Ukrainian frontline communities, providing counter-disinformation and information operations training to mayors and local at-risk communities. And, a lot of Russian information operations have targeted these local communities. And so what they wanted to do, or have been doing, is trying to build the capacity of these local mayors to be able to identify and triage different types of harmful narratives, and then teaching them how to respond to that. And of course, they're also they've also been trying to pump information into the occupied territories, so trying to communicate with those areas too. The Center for Counter-Disinformation, they have worked within the ministries to help sort of prepare ministerial level personnel to respond to disinformation operations. So what they have done is they would be monitoring, this is a couple years ago, but they were monitoring Telegram and other channels to basically identify narratives. When they see narratives that are of concern, that they would raise these issues to the ministries and basically provide talking points on how to respond and recommended responses. One example that they gave us at the time was a debunked false narrative Russia was targeting at the First Lady, Elena Lazinski, about how she was spending money in New York, I think, on jewelry, while her people obviously were fighting back in Ukraine. So they were able to identify that, quickly establish that that was a false narrative, and then we were able to provide the information, the evidence out there that could quell that particular false narrative. And then, of course, you also have the military Stratcom. They oversee defense information activities, PSYOP, and public-facing communications. And of course, they're working to develop surrender campaigns, campaigns targeting Russian frontline troops, along those lines. So, a lot of different government organizations engaged in this. Certainly one of the most interesting aspects was the civil society space. I have some of these organizations listed on the right. You have Vox Ukraine, which debunks Russian content. They do fact checks via Meta third-party system. They're broadcasting explainers on regional TV, so trying to push information out that way. Detector Media monitors disinformation, develops AI tools, reaches occupied territories via satellites and radio. Internews Ukraine promotes independent journalism. They document atrocities, then help Ukrainians and assist Ukrainians as sort of a trusted partner with Meta. So you have an IREX, which is not a Ukrainian organization, but an international organization, has been heavily engaged in media literacy for a number of years in Ukraine. Ukraine has a one-voice policy on paper, but what oftentimes many people talk to us about was this sort of beehive approach that they undertake to information operations. And by beehive, you have many different bees sort of swirling about, doing their own thing, but somehow when you look at the hive, they're all working together and coordinated on addressing a single particular issue. And so you have all these different organizations on the government side and all the civil society efforts doing individual things, but somehow working in a coordinated fashion to address Russian information operations. On the international front, let's see, do I have this? No, I don't have the slide. On the international front, maybe at the end I'll showcase a particular interesting briefing or information operation that we saw coming out of Ukraine. But Ukraine, of course, also has to work with influencing a litany of international audiences to help ensure that the international community is, voting in their favor, but then, of course, and most significantly, providing money and arms to continue the fight against Russia. So on a number of different levels, we see examples where Ukraine has excelled on this, and you can almost look at the outpouring of international support, both in online social media support for Ukraine, but then of course also the money factor and the governmental support for Ukraine as an indicator of the success of their international war. And of course, Zelensky plays a big role in this. He's very telegenic. He's very good in front of the camera. He has put out a number of inspiring messages. I think, as you see on the left here, this is a still image from his famous tweet saying, "We are here. We're still in Kyiv," as Russia was conducting its initial invasion. You also have, I think, one of the most interesting aspects of Ukraine is just this outpouring of social media engagement from Ukrainian activists to reach the international community. And I always like this image of this young girl wearing the prom dress that she would have worn in the backdrop of the destruction of Kharkiv. But, thousands of Ukrainians took to social media to share their story with the international community. I think we could have an entire briefing just on highlighting the different types of social media posts that have gone viral within the international world. So these influencers, I think, played a very big role in probably doing a number of different things. One, establishing a connection, a personal, individual connection with individual social media users. Obviously, publicizing in very sometimes heartfelt, sometimes funny, sometimes unanticipated ways of communicating their bombardments and the threat that they're facing. And it's obviously very compelling content. I mean, seeing the stories of resilience and other things like that were coming from these influencers was really valuable. So for the Ukrainian message cause. And then finally you have, I think I can play this. Can I play this? No, I can't. So finally, you also have other interesting forms of communications. On the right is a still image, I think, of a video I probably wanted to share. That is basically it's a message that was put out on the MOD's Twitter account. But the MOD basically partnered with an organization of strategic communication experts. So they outsourced their Twitter account to this organization of experts. And the experts basically produced all these very interesting thank you videos that were very that were funny, that were poignant, but that also spoke to the unique international character that they were trying to reach to. So for this one, it's a thank you video for the French sharing of their versions of the howitzer guns. But it sort of plays it off as a love letter with a lot of phallic representations of the artillery equipment, and I think that went quite viral in France, and they saw that as an interesting way for Ukraine to be speaking to that French audience to help build those relationships. Finally, there's the information war in Ukraine. Also, I should note the civil society piece as well. There were a lot of different civil societies engaged also on the international arena. I'm looking at my notes to see if I can find some examples of these. But a number of different organizations were also sort of engaged in putting out content on YouTube, on reaching international journalists, and working with different organizations within Europe and the United States, Ukrainian organizations within Europe and the United States, Again, all with the goal of helping to build those international connections. So finally, talking through the Ukrainian war, the information war against Russia. This has been a particularly hard nut to crack, and you can see that by the quote here from a Ukrainian expert where it says, it's hard to change the perceptions inside Russia. No one can do it. At the start of the war, which is most of our data is from, Ukraine undertook a number of different efforts to reach and influence the Russian population. They had the Come Back Alive campaign that allowed Russian families to check on captured or killed relatives. The I Want to Live for Russian soldiers seeking to surrender, and I think over 26,000 calls and 46 million website visits at the time of January 2024. They did a lot of direct messaging campaigns. Zelensky and other officials appealed to Russian citizens, warning of heavy casualties in leadership and psychological operations targeted frontline troops with leaflets and texts and videos. And then, of course, media outreach as well. There were a lot of different efforts undertaken. Overall, obviously it's proven a tough nut to crack, partly because Russia was able to so effectively control their media space by limiting certain types of websites and cutting off most social media channels, criminalizing individuals who would criticize or attack the Russian policies. We've had a number of different conversations with folks about this. I think there's just a general view that it's really hard to influence inside Russia right now. One of the key, I think, ways I will say that the U.S. has engaged in this space on the Russian inside Russia is with Radio Free Europe. I think Radio Free Europe and MUkraine media have been playing a sort of a big role in trying to reach audiences inside Russia. Some of those can reach as much as 10 or 15% of the Russian population, depending on whether or not certain events within inside Russia increase demand for legitimate news, I think, such as the terror attacks that occurred there last year. So, those efforts, I think, have the goal of trying to soften up elements of the population. There is an element within Russia, I think, that does not support these operations, but the current environment does not allow them to express that, or certainly not to act on it. But even just to be able to reach them has value. But again, obviously, we're several years into this war, and Russia's appetite, at least Putin's appetite for sustaining casualties, seems pretty high at this point. So obviously, it hasn't affected the calculation. Okay, so I want to pause there and then move over and talk a little bit about lessons learned. So what lessons we distill from this? One is this need to prepare for 3 theaters of war on the information side. This includes developing innovative ways to reach and influence populations behind the Iron Curtain. Number 2, rallying international institutions to counter disinformation. And 3, supporting host nation institutions to make sure that domestic will remains and will to fight remains strong. It's a lot. I think it poses a number of different challenges. It's obviously difficult for Ukraine to do this, I think, and is particularly hard for, I think, any institution, organization, or state to be able to manage information operations that are so broad. But it does articulate the challenge that is before Ukraine now, and certainly will be before other nations, U.S. in the future at some point. Building critical host nation institutions in advance of conflict. I think one of the key lessons that we learned from this is just the importance of building capacity in advance. I think had the Maidan Revolution and all the different types of supporting efforts that were underway because of that to build the capacity for all these years, if that had not taken place, or if those responses had not taken place, I think Ukraine would be in a different place right now, at least from an information perspective. So you really need to identify areas that are at risk and then try to build those institutions in advance. For the U.S., that might mean Taiwan is certainly one area that is under the gun, as it were, for a potential invasion. but there might be others as well, and certainly Eastern Europe would fall within this category too. So we need to build these institutions in advance because you can't build it once the war starts. You have to build and maintain U.S. institutions. So, on the Ukrainian side, you have multiple state organizations, government organizations that, again, have had several years now to build capacity before the Russian invasion. The U.S. needs to make sure that U.S. capacity is similar. I think the U.S. has divested from a number of different capabilities that would otherwise, might be in play for prosecuting and defending against an information war of the type that Ukraine is facing. I won't get into the details of those, but those types of divestments propose, have the potential to create risk for the future. On the Department of Defense side of the house, the U.S. has limited numbers of psychological operations units, which play a big role in promoting narratives that are protective against adversary disinformation. There's doctrine that needs to be updated in this place, and we make a big point of arguing that the U.S. needs to be doing war games and other types of activities to prepare for these operations. Civil society, I think civil society plays a huge role in Ukraine. And civil society has value for a number of different reasons. Number one, they have trust and credibility within the population. They're by not being associated with the government, they lose the stink that can often be associated with government. And so, they offer credibility from that perspective. They offer a continuity because these organizations remain even when new governments come in or go, or new bureaucrats come in or leave. These institutions provide a key continuity for how society can respond to these types of information operations. They're also able to speak to their local constituencies. These different organizations each have unique and different constituents. They have relationships with them. They understand those constituents, and it provides an opportunity for basically the government to help coordinate a response that can gain deep inroads into a population. Building and maintain trust is a big deal. We've heard that at a number of different levels, at least at the first time we went. This was a big focus of these operations to help maintain trust. What do we mean by building, maintain trust? Avoiding false information operations, avoiding using false narratives, avoiding sock puppet campaigns, fake social media campaigns, things along those lines are important. The influencers have played a really big role on a number of different levels. The civilian population, of course, was heavily involved with local influence with getting their message out, but then also military personnel, as some of these images show here, also play a big role. And these influencers help maintain relationships. They humanize the conflict in important ways. They help maintain relationships by, getting in inboxes and getting in search line. Social media posts that can reach audiences. So there are ways to just help make this happen. It does not have to be random happenstance. Governments, we made an argument in previous reports that governments can undertake certain policies and initiatives to help identify and build relationships with potential influencers, to share content with those influencers, to incentivize them in sharing their stories about whatever issues are important. So we think this is a big lesson from Ukraine. Building U.S. resilience of U.S. troops. The front lines are a place of very heavy information operations targeting different units. I think each country is sending text messages out to troops on the front lines and other places. There's obviously leaflets that are being disseminated. But more than that, there are information campaigns because, everyone's on social media these days. You can reach troops through a variety of different means, not just by leaflets, by getting in their social media accounts, for example, and sending them messages through those mediums, or monitoring social media to be able to identify what troops are saying. A few years ago, the Center for Strategic Communications, NATO Center for Strategic Communications, basically did a campaign where there was a NATO exercise, and they undertook an effort basically using false social media accounts and other things. They created fake Facebook pages about the exercise, which resulted in a lot of different members of the military community participating in those exercises to join those Facebook pages. Those troops then shared a lot of information about the exercise that they weren't supposed to, all because they're able to catfish them with this account. So there's a lot needs to happen to make sure that troops are have a degree of resilience against foreign information operations. And then do not allow coordination to sacrifice speed in responding. I think the strength of the Ukrainian beehive approach was that they did do coordination, but the coordination was not a limiting factor, right? They had the beehive approach. And with the beehive approach, individual bees can respond to intruders as necessary. And that is what they did. It provided opportunity for having multiple organizations, provided redundancy in the system. So different organizations could monitor different media spaces and then respond quickly. I think the U.S. military in particular gets focused on ensuring an effective coordinated response, which is great if you can do it. But don't let coordination sacrifice speed, not in the disinformation game. And then be prepared to take risks. We look at the video, I couldn't show you, but the video about the Ukrainian thank you note to France using the phallicized howitzers. That's from the U.S. perspective, that would be perceived as very risky type of communication. But those types of risks are really important to get your message out. And sometimes you have to take those risks. And so you just can't have too much of a top-down control over all messaging, because you end up having messaging that is staid and uninteresting and something that's just not going to influence. We highlight three different key aspects of these information campaigns. One is pre-bunking, making sure, and that relates to narratives as well. Both involve getting your message out early. Trying to build pre-bunking basically says, hey, we know that this operation is going to happen. So, for example, the false flag operation that Russia did, that the pre-bunking of that operation effectively destroyed it and played a big role in maintaining international support for Ukraine. So those operations are key. Narratives are key, because with narratives, you're basically arguing why people should believe something, not arguing that what they heard was false, which is what debunking is. But both of those, debunking, fact checking, and then getting out proactive narratives are really key. And then finally, recognize the risk of waning support over time. I think one thing Ukraine has seen is that over the course of several years now, they've had to work harder and harder to maintain support for Ukraine. That is particularly true here in the United States. So I think in the immediate aftermath of a conflict starting, it's a novelty, if nothing else, and maintains immediate interest. But maintaining that support is the key challenge. And so with that, that is my brief, and happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. HELMUS. This was very, very enlightening, and we have time to open questions. Please, we have several people here from Marshall University, and we welcome their comments or questions, please. I have my own also. Do I have anyone right now? Yes, please, Katerina.
Thank you so much for taking us through all this and for educating us on this really important topic, and very beautifully done. You have the heart of a teacher. Of a couple things. The photo you showed of comments, really, the photo you showed of Zelensky and his cabinet in Kiev that day with showing that they are all still there despite the bombing was incredibly powerful. I think, and as you mentioned, I remember the entire. I'm from Philadelphia originally. It's a very large Ukrainian immigrant community there, and people were like weeping at the Ukrainian Center when they saw that. And I remember it. I remember he said President, tut. And then he went through the titles, chief of this, tut, here. Minister of Finance, tut, here, like just like literally like saying it. And it was incredibly powerful. I'd never thought of it in the lens of like an information campaign. I thank you. So thank you for putting that into like a wider context of why it was so effective. I just had an emotional response to it, but it's also brilliant. It was a brilliant strategy.
You can also, what's interesting too is the contrast with Putin. Remember, I think this was a time where COVID was still a concern, right?
Yeah.
So, you had this contrast between Zelensky out there facing the rockets, and of course he'd done a number of these visits to frontline troops and exposed arenas. I think he was just in Kharkiv just the other week or two ago. And whereas Zelensky, a lot of the images that were coming out to him was him being at a long table with the generals about 30 feet from him because he's afraid of getting COVID. So really in strategic communications, everything you do is a message.
No
I think
details are
Zelensky knows that intuitively and professionally. And it's interesting that Russia, who's supposed to be really good at this, how they sort of fall flat so easily sometimes.
I believe that's also when I think the green T-shirt, the military color green T-shirt became a thing was with that same post. I think it was the first time that it just kind of like stuck out. But so thank you for sharing, for taking us all the way back to that moment. Thank you for talking about the rumors of President Zelensky's wife going on a shopping spree. I remember those headlines too very vividly. And that did have the potential to derail. I remember many years ago, was it Sarah Palin? There was there's a vice presidential candidate who was accused of going on a shopping spree, as part of the I think attack against John McCain's campaign, and the importance of pre-bunking. That I think is a very new idea, at least for me, who's outside of this field. I just wanted to say thank you. I appreciate all of these. There's various moments in your presentation that just very strongly I knew of, but didn't fully appreciate the context in which they were happening. So I just thank you. Thank you very much for taking the time to educate us on this.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Katerina. Anara, please.
Thank you very much for your very interesting report and very timely. And I think that if we see the situation wider, not only focusing on the Russo-Ukrainian war, I think it was actually overlooked. I think that Russian propaganda is such expensive and sophisticated project, and especially Russia Today, Sputnik, they successfully target multicultural population across the world. In addition, as you mentioned, media platforms such as Telegram, Twitter, Vkontakte, VK, and others, they are very, very successful everywhere, including in United States among certain groups of population. So that what could be done to diminish the damage of Russian disinformation machine in short and long term? And also, what do you think about regional and global efforts to develop protection against Russia's disinformation campaign or system? Thank you.
I'll take the last question first. What could be done to help internationally against Russia? Number one, I think, is building capacity of key states and institutions. The U.S., I'm not sure these efforts are ongoing, but I think back in 2024 and 25, the U.S. was, for example, trying to work with countries like Cote d'Ivoire and Nigeria and others to help these countries build to build institutions that could help monitor Russian disinformation operations, identify content that was potentially or significantly threatening, and then rack and stack that to be able to implement policies to expose it or to counter it or to undermine it. I mean, that requires a capable, established institution with strong people and who have the right playbooks at hand. So I think that type of capacity building is really key. I would say that U.S. And others had worked, in Europe, in Eastern Europe, for example, for a number of different years to build the capacity of those countries to be able to do this. And so, thinking about how Russia is targeting like this sort of pan-world efforts in their campaigns, it would be key to identify some of the key areas that are underexposed, that are sort of underprepared, and prepare them. And there's established frameworks for doing that. In terms of and the other part I think is, ensuring that there's strong international organizations at play in this. Information rarely targets a single border. Adversary information operations rarely target a single border. What's targeting France or what's targeting the United States is also reaching other countries. And that probably means that all these different countries need to enhance the cooperation and international framework and institutions. So they're meeting regularly, they're sharing intelligence, they're agreeing on what intelligence should be shared, because a lot of this involves sharing intelligence with a wider population. And so making sure that we're responding to this pan-region Russian disinformation with a pan-region response.
Mhm.
In terms of what could be done on the short term and long term for Ukraine, that's a really interesting question. I'd say that Ukraine is, I think, in a different spot than what it was when I went there in 2023. When we went there was, number one, they weren't being targeted as much by Russia air operations. So people were getting more sleep, which I think is a big issue. And there was, a very strong message of, we're doing this, we're winning this, we can do this. Look how great we are, right? There's a lot of pride in what they were doing. There was a sense that they were defeating Russia on the information battlefield. And we went back last year, and I would say that viewpoint was not as strong when we went back. I think people were tired from the constant air operations. I think that affects morale. But also, I think there were domestic issues within the country that they were facing, along the lines of who can get recruited into the military is a big issue. Is that being done fairly or not fairly? All sorts of instances where we heard stories about how Ukrainians were trying to, forcibly recruit people out of concerts and things like that. So obviously, those are not good stories from a resilience perspective, I think. So, ensuring that the government has its policies right. Because I think what Russia likes to do with these operations is they target, they eagerly target any instances where there are gulfs in the population, where there are splits, where there are wedges. And they like to drive those wedges apart even further. So if the Ukrainian society is struggling with mobilization issues, then that is a prime target for Russia to attack. So yeah.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anara. Anyone else, please? I have one question meanwhile. Dr. Helmus, maybe you can elaborate a few words on Orthodox Church, because we have heard so much about Russian propaganda narrative of persecution of Orthodox religion in Ukraine, Russian Church, and people here in the West are completely unaware of the circumstance.
So that's a fascinating question that you ask, and I'll tell you, I know very little about the Orthodox Church, but I do understand that Americans care deeply about fellow Christians. And there's an organization based out of Kyiv that's I forget the name of the individual at this moment, but it's run by a conservative chief of staff who used to work in Congress, in the U.S. Congress, and he's there helping to support Ukraine. Well, they ended up running ads in the U.S. Highlighting how Russia was targeting, I don't know if it was Orthodox, but I think they highlighted how Russia was targeting Ukrainian evangelicals. And those messages that were directed directly at American conservatives resonated deeply with that audience, and it was a very successful campaign and got a lot of traction. And I've even heard that, a broader message campaign to help Speaker Johnson recognize the degree to which Russia is attacking Christian communities within Ukraine may have played a role in helping spur support for a funding package a year or so ago. So I think this is an issue that is not probably highlighted enough. It's an issue that could resonate with American audiences. I think the key is that you just have to reach them with these messages. So I think the Facebook campaigns and other things like that, where you can get contact directly in their feeds and highlight this issue and how Russia is killing Christians, I think that's a big thing to do.
Thank you. Any more questions or comments, please? What Dr. HELMUS was saying for the last hour rings very close to our task and goals here, because we obviously are one of those outlets, university-based, which tries in English language to explain to international audience of many aspects going on around Ukraine. And it's not, we recognize how uneasy it is, and especially what you mentioned lately about the waning interest, the way people are tired of the headlines. Dr. Smith, please.
Hi, thank you so much. Dr. Helmus, has this ever happened before in a war, where you're getting social feed updates and identified life stories in the context of war and crowdfunding for the war chest? Has this ever happened before?
So it's interesting. I will say, so, I mean, ISIS played a big role in the opposite side of the house, I guess, is that ISIS used social media effectively. And for them, it was getting content out on Twitter, right? And their messages were horrific and everything, but still effective for reaching their target audience. And but it was on Twitter. I think the unique thing that's happening now with Ukraine is the war started at the same time you have TikTok. And TikTok does something very unique for Ukraine that the other platforms don't. Because with TikTok, you don't need to follow anybody. You're given content based almost solely on the compelling nature of that content to influence you. And so it's not about who you follow. You don't have to go out and look for the content. The content is basically presented to you in your feeds. And so I think because of that, the Ukrainian influencers were able to gain such a rapid degree of influence over the international landscape, is because of how quickly they got in folks' feeds. I think you're seeing that the same thing now with Gaza is happening. That TikTok is playing a big role in mobilizing, for example, support for Palestinians. But I think Ukraine is the first war that to really take advantage of the TikTok effect, and helped circumvent the need to go look for the content. The content came to you.
It's fascinating to me to watch this unfold. I don't use TikTok because I'm afraid of the China connection with TikTok. Yeah. So I don't stay on that, but I do follow a number of threads on Reddit having to do with Ukraine. And I've noticed that oftentimes information will be on a thread in Reddit about 2 days before it hits the mainstream media, if the mainstream media picks it up.
Right. And now the mainstream media is like also getting their news sources from these accounts.
Right.
And I think the other interesting thing too is, at the time of the war started, people were very keen and interested in Ukraine. And at that point, probably many people like me found accounts to follow. Now maybe people's interest wanes over time, and doesn't for me because I have a professional interest in Ukraine. But, for other people, the interest wanes over time a little bit. But those people are still in your feeds. Ukraine is still talking to you, even when you're not out there necessarily looking for Ukraine information. And I think that's really important. It keeps Ukraine in people's minds. You're still maintaining this relationship with influencers that you followed at the excitement of the invasion, but 2 years later they're still talking to you and you're listening.
Yes, I think the American mind is particularly focused on the identified life. When we have an identified life, all of a sudden we get interested in it. And I do remember just a number of identified lives that have presented themselves, at least through Reddit. Now, that's the only social media that I look at. Um, there was a fellow fighting on the front lines at the steel plant, and they called him War Stash because he had a really cool mustache. Um, I fear that he may have been killed because I haven't heard anything about him in a couple of years now.
Yeah.
But people followed him because he just embodied the zeitgeist of the Tatars and the the tough Ukrainians. Um, but I think America in particular really does resonate with the identified life, and I think Ukraine and Ukrainians, just general regular people in Ukraine, have figured this out and are just using this masterfully to keep people involved. There's even a stupid thread on Reddit called Cats of Ukraine.
Yeah.
And the soldiers are showing their cats in tactical gear and that they love their kitty cats and scritch their kitty cats and the cats aren't afraid and all these kinds of things. And for like little women like me, that resonates and that helps me remember to keep supporting, keep praying, keep donating and keep interested and keep talking to my representatives. Yeah.
Carol, you are so right. I mean, I still have faces in front of me that I can remember at different points in the war. Some names I remember, but all faces I remember, and it's their stories. And when I talk to the people, they know the same. You're right. What's that term you used? Individual.
The identified life.
Identified life. That is so valuable.
This came into the American consciousness a long, long time ago. There was a little girl named Jessica who fell into a well, in the backyard of her house. She was like 2 years old, maybe a little less than 2 years old.
I remember this, yeah.
And the news media got hold of this, and all of a sudden the United States came to a grinding halt.
We kept vigil. The whole country kept
vigil for this poor little girl. And finally, I believe, I don't remember, but I believe they got some skinny young man to get down in that pipe with her and get her out. I can't remember for sure, but the outcome was that she was ultimately safe. Her family did continue to struggle. And I don't know if she struggled later in life, but her family was not well off and they did continue to struggle. But I do remember how the United States just came to a grinding halt and we all just wanted to know what's going on with Jessica. So, yeah. And my life, I do not go through a single day without checking my Reddit feeds to literally see how Ukraine is doing. How's Ukraine doing? How's Ukraine doing? And, yeah, I hate it that this is dragging on so long. I hate it that these people have to face this. It grinds at me, and I don't understand why the United States hasn't stepped in to do more. But I'm just a citizen. I'm just a woman following my Reddit feeds, coming and listening to MUkraine. I feel so helpless, and I just wish we could do more. I just wish we could do more.
Thank you. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you.
Let me thank Dr. HELMUS once again, and we'll conclude. Leslie, question. Please, Leslie Titus.
Yes, well, I'm afraid I'm maybe going to kind of rain on the hopefulness parade that Carol and Katerina were just having. But as someone who studied disinformation, why do you think it is that obviously there are some people on the left, I'm thinking of like Oliver Stone and some other people who have had shown some affinity for the Russian narratives about things. But why do you think it's so prevalent, particularly on the right, not just with media figures like Tucker Carlson, who obviously had that long, boring interview with Putin at the Kremlin, but also with politicians and cabinet members and the like Tulsi Gabbard and Donald Trump, not just pulling back from things like Radio Free Europe that can make a difference against Russian disinformation, but actively just propagating Russian talking points, and Trump just taking Putin's word for it with things like Putin claiming that the Ukrainians attacked his dacha and things like that. Why do you think that's so prevalent on the right?
Yeah, I can't really answer your question directly. I would say that I think support for Ukraine runs into American first ideology, which then plays into, I think, the Russian message, and I can't say that the decline in support among the right for Ukraine is a result of Russian information ops. I don't know that. I've not seen direct evidence of that. There's certainly examples where some on the right might pick up on some of these narratives that Russia's pushing out, but how impactful that is, it's hard to say. But the broadly American first ideology is that we don't support foreign intervention. Now that I think that's being tested with the United States in the last few weeks, but take that as it is. If that is an ideology or a viewpoint or a policy perspective for a large, significant share of the U.S. population, then I think Russia is in a good, decent place to hammer on that perspective and to attempt to promote it and broaden that message to reach a greater audience. So I don't know if the right is more or less gullible or associated with these Russian narratives per se, but I do think there's sort of a confluence of factors that give Russia an opportunity for information, so a superiority. Not superiority, but an opportunity for Russia to drive a wedge between that.
Thank you. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Dr. HELMUS. And I will ask Dr. Shrey for her address to our Ukrainian viewers.
Дорогі браття і сестри в Україні, ми зберігаємо вас у наших щоденних думках і молитвах. Нехай милосердний Бог тримає вас у своїй опіці. До наступного тижня. Прощаємося.
Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
Heroim slava.